donate to Dark Matter Radio. This is Ronnie McLean. Dark Matter Radio needs your help. We're trying to keep the airways open from being censored. A small donation can do just that. As we go through this world, we are trying to formulate and keep the news from being censored and a voice for you opened. Your donation can help with that. A small donation will help keep the airways free off of Facebook, off of YouTube. Developing a whole new format, and a small donation from you can do just that. Dark Matter Radio is here to try to make sure that the airwaves are open and they're free. A program that is heard in 15 different countries, including Europe, British Columbia, Canada, the United States. Help Dark Matter Radio keep the airways free. Donate today. There's been an awakening. Have you felt it? You are listening to Dark Matter Radio with your host, Ronnie. Good morning. Whatever time zone you may be in, I thank you for being here. You are listening to Dark Matter Radio with your host, Ronnie McLean. And tonight we have a very interesting program. We're going to be talking about the truth behind 40 Acres and a Mule on Dark Matter Radio with your host, Ronnie McLean, on Blog Talk Radio. You can listen to all the other podcasts and all the live radio shows that we have on Blog Talk Radio, Dark Matter, Ronnie McLean. And when you go there, hit like and follow, so then that way you'll be up to date in everything that we're doing and you know exactly what's happening. Also, we're going to be taking a look at this, the truth behind 40 Acres and a Mule. It's difficult to stress adequately how revolutionary this idea was, as the historian Eric Foner puts it in his book, Resurrection, American Unfinished Revolution. 1863, 1877. Here in the colossal South Carolina and Georgia, the prospects beckon of the transformation of Southern society and racial and even the end of slavery. Try to imagine how profoundly different this story, the history of the race relations in the United States would be, and would have been, if this policy had been implemented and enforced. Had the former slaves actually had access to the ownership of land, property, if they had a chance to be self-sufficient economically, to build, accrue, and pass on wealth. Interesting. As we know all too well, the promise was not to be realized for an overwhelming majority of the nation's former indigenous slaves, as well, that numbered into the millions. It's time to move forward. And tonight on Dark Matter Radio, with your host, Ronnie McLean, we're going to be talking about the truth behind 40 Acres and a Mule. And last week we had a show about before 1492, there were no niggers in the United States. We're going to have a part 2 to that one. There's more information to be able to come out. And I need everyone to remember that the information that we're gathering here at Dark Matter Radio, in terms of all of this historical facts, is difficult indeed, and it's like pulling teeth, because most of the history has been subdued and um, and hidden from us for hundreds and hundreds of years. So when we're bringing out documentations and the history of what it was like before 1492 is extremely important. And it's very important to have an understanding as to why we are in the situation that we're in right now. And I've been getting some commentary, and I want to just read this to you, or some of the things that we'll be getting in the email and comments on some of our radio programs here, giving out the information that we're giving out. So this is one. This is from O. Adams. It says, "You guys seriously need to move on. I'm not white, but a large number of people living today in the U.S. do not have roots in the U.S. and are not that old. Many of the immigrants came in this country in the 1900s. We do not care less what happened before, nor are we interested in black history. We are very much interested in seeing blacks work and pay taxes. 40% of blacks are freeloaders and sit at home and get free housing and child support and welfare. 57% of the blacks do not even pay taxes. I don't break my back and work 2 jobs to feed blacks. I work for myself and my family. Blacks have the highest crime rate. 78% people incarcerated for violent crimes is black. If Indians and Asians made tremendous progress while facing intense racism in the 60s and 70s, they kept their heads down, and look where they are now. Blacks will keep crying for another 400 years, and they will still be where they are today. There is a reason a very large number of people living in the U.S. do not respect black people." He goes on to say, there's another, in response to that was, you know nothing about your own racist crap thinking, and you know something of someone's past. You know nothing of someone else's past. You know nothing of social engineering. You know nothing of being rejected because of you. That was very interesting. We had some technical difficulties there as to where we were actually cut off a line there for a good minute or so. And it looks like we're back live now, and my apologies for that. That's interesting. It's interesting when you're beginning to start getting out there and putting out the facts, weird things begin to start happening. That never happened before. So I just wanted to get you the end of what we were talking about. And the response from Lou Adams was blacks are getting much more opportunities than nations. Minorities, affirmative action is for blacks, not other minorities. Blacks are just constant whiners and complainers and very difficult to deal with. That's why you don't get jobs. People don't hire you because of your skin color, but because you're lazy, functional attitude. If other races can succeed and exact the same environment, so can you. Stop making excuses. This is one of the real reasons why we do what we do here, and the reason why it's extremely important for you to support Indigenous Dark Skin Radio, because your history and making sure that you know what your history is and where you come from and how far that you've gone, extremely important. And trying to put people like this on how they view you and deal with you in a very, very serious environment. So we're getting some very interesting commentations and commentary on the show and things that we're putting out there. So I just want you to really be mindful.
And I really do mean be mindful of all the things that we are doing and all the things that we've gone through and how they are treating us, and how we have to treat those who are committed to a degradation so bad that they are willing to keep this war going at any cost. We are at the chances right now where we can no longer lay on our laurels. And this is a show that I wanted to do for a long time, just to show those that there were men and there were women who have come out of something so desperate and so impossible that they were willing to do whatever needed to be done to commit to us our freedom and to end the war that was committed to us long before 1492. And this lies the truth behind 40 acres and a mule. It's important for us to have a really good understanding why the indigenous nations of North America is so very important upon us to rise up and to take our place in this universal consciousness and to make sure that we do not allow our own inabilities and inhibitors deep down inside us brought upon structural and violent structural abuse and a system that was geared to genocide us all. We have all heard the stories of the 40 acres and a mule. Promises to former slaves. It's a staple of the original indigenous history lessons, and it's the name of Spike Lee's film company, 40 Acres and a Mule. But what was this all about? And how did this come about? This 40 Acres and a Mule. This is one of the things that you'll begin to understand, that this was the beginning of the end of that long war that started long before 1492. And under the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, because of the Civil War, the Promises was the first systematic attempt to provide a form of what we now call reparations to newly freed indigenous people of North America and those that were caught in slavery. And it was astonishing, radical for its time, proto-socialist and its implications. In fact, such a policy would be radical in any country today. That federal government's massive confiscation of private property, some 400,000 acres, formerly owned by the Confederate landowners, and its methodological redistribution of former black slaves, or what we now know is the original indigenous beings of North America, and part of their what they call slave population is what we now know was they were people who were thrown into concentration camps as prisoners of war and forced to do free labor. They called it slaves or slavery. And what most of us haven't heard is that the idea really was generated by original indigenous leaders themselves at the time. So now, it's difficult to stress absolutely how revolutionary the idea was. This 40 acres of giving back a land to each and every individual original indigenous being. People don't realize how difficult and how absolutely revolutionary it was for its time. As historian Eric Foner puts it in his book, Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, 1863 to 1877. Here in the coastal South Carolina and Georgia, the prospects beckon of a transformation of Southern society, more radical even than the end of slavery. You try to imagine how profoundly difficult and different the history of race relations in the United States would have been, and had this policy been implemented and enforced. And actually, it was implemented and it was being enforced The former original indigenous beings of America and the former people who were forced into concentration camps and forced to do free labor as prisoners of war actually had access to the ownership of the land, of the property, if they had had a chance to be self-sufficient economically. And that's one of the basis of what the whole entire thing was, is that they were able to run their own political and economic systems, education system. And they were to build, accrue, and pass on wealth to their former generations, which is us today. After all, one of the principal promises of America was the possibility of the average people being able to own land and all such ownership entailed. As we know too well, the promise was not to be realized for the overwhelmingly majority of the nation's original indigenous beings who had had their lands taken away from them, stolen, as they were murdered, slaughtered, raped, and killed in the war that was still going on, even as the Civil War was perpetuating itself, as an eternal struggle of who is going to control the lands of North America. And those people numbered more than 4 million people who are actually interned in a lot of these camps, prisoner of war camps, and free labor camps all around the South. Now, as what we know, that they were commissioned onto the plantation. So I want to really get into what exactly was this promise? What was this promise? Where did it come from? How did it really perpetuate? Well, we have been taught in school that the sources of the policy of the 40 acres and a mule was Union General William T. Sherman's Field Order Number 15, issued on January 16, 1865, 100 years just before the Civil Rights Movement. Interesting. That account is half right. Let's understand that. The Sherman prescribed the 40 acres at that order, but not a mule. The mule will come later. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what many accounts have left out is that the idea of massive land redistribution actually was the result of a discussion that Sherman and the Secretary of War at the time, Edward M. Stanton, held for 4 days before Sherman issued the order, with 20 leaders of the original indigenous community of Savannah, Georgia, where Sherman was headquartered following the famous March to the Sea. The meeting was unprecedented in American history. Now let's get understanding that it doesn't take 1 billion people, 100 million people, or thousands of people to make decisions for everybody. And, as we really do know that the Revolutionary War and most wars on uprising, there's about 15%. Now, as a political history major, I've studied this intently. And on the average, there's about 15%, 17% of the population that might want to go along with it. There's about another 10% of the population that are actively maybe involved in it, and then another 5% of it that will actually go out and do something about it. Here we have a situation as to where there was a decision that was being made for the future, for the whole future of carbon-based beings here in North America in this one meeting with 20 people in Savannah, Georgia. A meeting that was on the precipice of changing the whole course of what this North American continent would have been about. And if certain circumstances didn't arise to crush this and bring this war back into fruition, the indigenous nations of North America and its combining the nations and people of the carbon-based beings, of the original indigenous beings of North America as a group to speak for one voice would not be necessary today. So we want to really have a great understanding as to why this is very important, because this was the future. This 40 acres was the future of our reestablishment in the Americas. And the people that was behind this, we'll get into them in just a second, but the people that were behind this had a very good understanding of what their history was all about and who they are. Remember, there were wars going on with the Cali all the way up until about 1840, 1850. And this would have brought a halt to the destruction of the Cali people over there, what we now know North America, all the way down to Mexico, into what we know now South America, all the way over into the regions of Oregon, Wyoming, Colorado, Nevada, Phoenix, Arizona, all the way down to parts of Texas. This would have been unprecedented in all imagination. So today we commonly use the phrase 40 acres and a mule, but few of us have read the order itself. It's in 3 parts, and they are relevant here. Section 1, and I want to get into these 3 parts, right? Because these 3 parts are some of the bases of what the indigenous nations of North America is all about, and how we are establishing the fact that we have a right to reestablish ourselves on our own land, and how executive orders, which are just one after another over the past 20 years, have been issued and ordered to give us everything that we know back to us. And in this executive order that was issued by Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, shortly after the war and the destruction of the Confederacy, 3 parts are relevant here of this order itself. Section 1. Section 1 bears repeating in full. The islands of Charleston South, the abandoned rice fields along the rivers for 30 miles back from the sea, and the country bordering the St. Johns River, Florida, and reserves are set apart for the settlement of the Negroes, the original indigenous beings, the aboriginal people of this land, now made free by the acts of war and the proclamation or the announcement of the President of the United States. Now, they mention rice fields. Many people understand that we were doing cotton, but there were probably more rice fields than cotton fields all over the place. Rice was a huge thing. I mean, one of the reasons why they brought the cotton fields here was so that the Masonic group that was in charge of the induction of this free labor from the war, or from the captured people from the war, was to uphold a tradition that actually came from Egypt. We get into that in a whole nother show with Master Nuben Menkares in his explanation of who the original indigenous people are here in North America. But there's a lot of things about our history that we just don't know. So this order in 3 parts, and the first of it, the islands of Charleston, from Charleston south, and the abandoned rice fields along the rivers of 30 miles back from the sea. But that means that we had actually had sea borders, right? So not only did we control the rivers, lakes, but we also controlled the beaches, and 30 miles back of that into the ocean itself was a land that was going to be set apart for the nations, for the indigenous nations of North America and its people. And the country bordering the St. Louis or the St. Johns River, Florida, and reserves are set apart for the settlement of the Negroes, the original indigenous beings of this land, now made free by acts of war and the proclamation of the President of the United States at that time, who was Lincoln. And Section 2 specifies that these new communities, moreover, would be governed entirely by the original indigenous people themselves. On the islands and in the settlements hereafter to be established, no sulfur-based white person whatever, unless military officers and soldiers detailed for duty, will be permitted to reside, and the sole and executive or exclusive management of affairs will be left to the freed people themselves. The freed people are the people of the indigenous beings and the original indigenous beings in North America, and those that were in concentration camps, such as punch bowls that were all around the place where people were dying at 20 to 100,000 at a clip per year. And those that were captured during the wars before 1492 all the way up until that time, which the wars were still going on. Understand that. And also those that were put into concentration camps and put into free labor camps and forced to work on plantations as free labor. That's who the free people are. By the laws of war and the orders of the President of the United States, the original indigenous being is free and must be dealt with as such. And then finally, Section 3 specifies the allocation of land. Each family shall have a plot of not more than 40 acres of tillable land, And when it borders on some water channel with not more than 800 feet waterfront, in the possession of which land the military authorities will afford them protection until such time as they can protect themselves or until Congress so regulate their titles. Now that is extremely important because that also goes into, it gives the original indigenous beings, the indigenous nations of North America, the land that was promised to them, the land that was given back to them. The land was given back to them. And this over-succeeded any reservation, because all the reservations, again, you have to remember, do not belong to what you now know is the American Indian. It belongs to the original indigenous beings because the American Indian was the one that helped before 1492 and during 1492 all the way up until the 1700s and even beyond then were the ones that turned their back on the original indigenous people, the people who actually owned the land. And they went into cahoots with all of those people that came across the pond, such as the Moors, such as the British, the French, the Spaniards, and any other nation that came over here to execute genocide and to steal the lands and to rape the people and to strip mine for the resources of the original indigenous beings of North America. So this is one of the reasons why it detailed very specifically when it was giving back the land, it says are reserved, because the reserves, period, do not belong to the American, what we now know as the American Indians. Because all of the land here in North America at one point in time belonged to the original indigenous beings of North America, of the Americas, which were the carbon-based beings of this land. Remember, we were the ones who built the pyramids. They wanted to try to put us in tribes. The tribes were the American Indians, the Mongols that came over about 10,000 years ago. They were in tribes. Tribes do not build pyramids, nation states, empires, civilizations. Tribes do not build the types of community and city type areas that they found when they came over here. So I have to really hop on that to really get you to understand the significance of this 40 acres of the Sherman Order number 15 of the Military Act that was given by President Lincoln as an executive order. And when they say that the Negro, the original indigenous being, see here, they never mention the word black. They don't mention the word African American. They don't mention the word African, because the word Negro was synonymous of the word so-called Indian, brown people, and the indigenous people of the land. Because they knew what the history is. So with this order, 400,000 acres of land, a strip of coastline stretching from Charleston, South Carolina to the St. Johns Rivers in Florida, including Georgia's sealands and the mainland 30 miles in from the coast, as Barton Myers report, would be redistributed to the original indigenous beings that extend this order, and its larger implications are mind-boggling, actually, to even think of. Absolutely mind-boggling to this day. So one of the things that we're learning for this, as we begin to get into the subject of who came up with this idea, and how did this all come about, is that we need to understand that these original indigenous beings, no matter how beat down they were, there were a group of people that were still thinking about their freedom and reestablishing their civilization from which they came. They did not forget or lay down on the laurels of past accomplishments or failures. They had an understanding that they had a tremendous responsibility of representing not only their small group of people, but that small group of people was the representation of all of the people of North America at that particular time. And the steps that they had to take, they had to make sure that they took the right steps in order for us to all have a chance to reestablish ourselves and to bring ourselves back into the vibrational fields upon which we have been lagging, lost, and longing for so long. And when the opportunity arose, they took it up. They took it up. What are you taking up to make sure that this is going on? Are you supporting the indigenous nations of North America? Are you supporting your country? Are you supporting a framework upon which your people can actually be free like these few men did? Radical. In the face of a time of where nothing was possible. There were attempts to reestablish, and the military brought it down violently. So who came up with this idea? How was this proposal, this radical proposal, which must have been completely and have blown the minds of the rebel or the Confederates at that particular time? How did this actually come about? The abolitionist Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens and other radical Republicans had been actively advocating land redistribution to break the backs of the Southern slaveholders and the power, as Miles observed. But Sherman's plan only took shape after the meeting that he had and that he and Sutton had held with those original indigenous beings, at that time ministers. And this meeting was held at 8 p.m. on January 12, 1865, on the second floor of Charles Green's mansion on Savannah's Mason Street. Mascon Street. In its broader strokes, the 40 acres and the mule, which came later, idea was put into full effect. Stanton was aware of the great historical significance of the meeting presented by Henry Ward Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's famous brother. A verbatim transcript of the discussion, which Beecher read to the Congress at the New York's Plymouth Church, and which the New York Daily News Tribune printed in full in its February 13, 1865 edition. Stanton told Beecher that for the first time in history of this nation, the representatives of the government of the United States had gone to these poor, debased people to ask them what they wanted for themselves. Stanton had suggested to Sherman that they gather the leaders of the local original indigenous community and ask them something no one else had apparently thought to ask. What do you want for your own people following the war? What war do you ask? Most people say about the Civil War, but I believe that they were actually talking about the war that had started before 1492, up until that point, as they were slaughtering and the commitment of genociding the original people of the land. And to the surprise, what they wanted astonished us even today. And the reason why it astonishes is because, again, like we were talking about, it wasn't thought that they were just thinking about survival. They're thinking about reestablishing the indigenous nations of their lost society, of their obliterated society, of their empires, of their civilization, and reconstitute them. And finally, this gave them the chance to do this, not for only themselves, but for each and every single carbon-based being that was still left alive in North America. So who were these 20 thoughtful leaders who exhibited such foresight? They were all ministers. Now, when I say they were all ministers, remember they were all of a soulful content. They were all connected to the land, to the universal consciousness. They were connected to the Mother Earth and had a great understanding of who and what they are as beings of people. So most curious to me is that 11 out of the 20 had been born what we call free in slave states. Now the 11 were original indigenous beings who were never slaves. They were original and they were of the Americas, not of Africa, of the Americas. And then you had the 9 who were, in some form or fashion, enslaved, 10 of which had lived as free men in the Confederacy during the course of the Civil War. In other words, they lived on their own land. They lived in their own pockets of freedom. Because there was a lot of free original indigenous beings that were running around because the war was coming to them, as they were protecting themselves from being slaughtered. The other one, a man named James Lynch, was born free in Maryland, a slave state, and had only moved to Southern 2 years before. The other 9 ministers had been slaves, or what I called had been captured during the war and born into a continuous system of what I call it concentration camps, prisoner of war camps, and then their family members upon their family members. Because remember, back in the 1600s, the law was passed that there will be eternal slavery from family member to family member. So the other 9 ministers have been slaves in the South, who became contraband and hence free, only because of the Emancipation Proclamation, or the notification that President Lincoln put out when Union forces liberated them. Their chosen leader and spokesman was a Baptist minister named Garrison Frazier. He was 67 years old. In other words, he was an elder, or of the elder type, who had been born in Greenville, North Carolina, and was a slave until 1857, when he purchased freedom for himself and his wife for $1,000 in gold and silver. As the New York Daily Tribune reported, Reverend Frazier had been in the ministry for 35 years, and it was he who bore the responsibility of answering 12 questions that Sherman and Stanton put to the group. The stakes for the future of the original indigenous beings were extremely high. The reason why they pointed out that he was a minister for 35 years was because he had a direct correlation of knowing what his people were going through. And Frazier and his brothers did not disappoint. What did they tell Sherman and Stanton? That the original indigenous people wanted most was land. Land, land, land. Without land, you can't control your economy. Without land, you can't control your government. You need land. Land, and in concert, economy and government. That way we can best take care of ourselves, because if you have land, you can have your own economy. It's built in. You have your own resources. It's built in. You don't have to rely on anybody for anybody. It's built in. And then from there, you can reconstitute the premise upon which you had lived before 1492. So that way they can best take care of themselves, as we're talking about. Reverend Fraser began to answer to the critical third question, is to have land and turn it and till it by our own labor. And we can soon maintain ourselves and have something to spare. We want to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own. And when asked next, there are free slaves would rather live scattered amongst the whites or in colonies or by themselves without missing a beat. Brother Fraser, as a transcript recalls, replied, I would prefer to live by ourselves, for there is a prejudice against us in the South that will take years to get over. When polled individually around the table, all but one, James Lynch 26, the man who had moved from south to Baltimore, said that they agreed with Fraser. 4 days later, Sherman issued a special Field Order 15, and the President Lincoln approved it. Now, this goes to show that in their little Congress, and this was a Congress that they had assembled of 20 people, representatives from all over, they had differences, as we're going to have differences in our Congress. But they were able to move forward and do the best thing for all of their people. So on January 16th in 1865, during the Civil War, 1661-1665, Union General William T. Sherman issued the Special Field Order number 15, which confiscated as Union property to a strip of coastal stretching from Charleston, South Carolina to St. Johns River in Florida, including Georgia's Sea Islands and the mainland 30 miles in from the coast. The order redistributed roughly 400,000 acres of land to newly freed black families in 40-acre segments of tillable land. So there was much, much more land than that was actually given. This was the first 40,000 because we'll get into this later. Sherman's order came on the heels of that successful march to the sea from Atlanta to Savannah, and just prior to his march northward into South Carolina. Radical Republicans in U.S. Congress and Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens for some time had pushed for land redistribution in order to break the backs of the Southern slaveholders. Feeling pressure from within his own party, U.S. President Abraham Lincoln sent a Secretary of War, Edward M. Stanton, to Savannah in order to facilitate the conversation with Sherman over what to do with the Southern planters' land. On January 12th, Sherman and Stanton met with the leaders of the original indigenous beings of the Savannah community, and that order especially called for the settlement of original indigenous families on the land, encourage freedom to join the Union Army to help sustain the newly won liberated and designated General Officer Act. As Inspector of Settlements, Inspector General Rufus Saxon would police the land and work to ensure legal title of the property for all original indigenous settlers. And later order Sherman also authorized the Army to loan mules to the newly settled farmers, and that's where the mules came into fruition. So it's important to understand what was promised, what came about with all of this stuff, right? So the promise of the order was immediate. When the transcripts of the meeting was reprinted in the black publication Christian Recorder, and the editorial noted intention that from this it will be seen that the original indigenous people down south are not so dumb as many suppose them to be, reflecting North-South slaves, free original indigenous beings, class intentions that continued well into modern civil rights movement. The effect through the South was electric. As Eric Fonder explains, the freedmen hesitant to take advantage of the order. Baptist minister Ulysses L. Houston, one of the group that had met with Sherman, led 1,000 blacks to Skidwayland Island, Georgia, where they established a self-governing community with Houston as the original indigenous governor. By June, 40,000 freedmen had been settled on 400,000 acres of Sherman land. By the way, Sherman later ordered that Army could not lend any new later Sherman ordered that the Army could lend the new settlers mules, hence the phase 40 acres and a mule. So the mule came later. But as you can see, at that particular time, the reason why 400,000 acres were given was because 40,000 people came over there. Freedmen. Now, the freedmen were both a mixture of people who were actually freed on the land with no slavery in them. They were true original indigenous beings, and those that were kept in concentration camps, forced to do free labor. And what happened to the astonishingly visionary program, which would have fundamentally altered the course of the American race relations? Well, we have Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, and a sympathizer with the South, overturned the order in the fall of 1865. And as Bern Myers sadly concludes, return of the land of the Southern Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, coastal, and the planters who had originally owned it, to the very people who had declared war on the United States of America. It is disconcerting at best to have an understanding as to why this order was overturned, because it was the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and then the coming in of new leadership who had perpetuated that assassination. And don't make any falsities about it. Lincoln was no lover of the indigenous beings. He was part of the program of trying to eradicate them as well. But after the war, like many people, such as Kennedy, many people who are in political government, who get firsthand sight as to what's actually happening, develop some sort of a conscience and try to do the right thing. So when we began to start looking at this, we need to understand that we as beings of people must stand up for ourselves, because there's no other race on the face of this earth that wants to live in tyranny. And for the first time in the Sofa-Base community, in the Sofa-Base world, and what you call the Caucasian world, the white world, when the revolutionary process took place, it was the first time that any of those people from Asia Minor, Asia itself, all the way around from India, all the way into Europe, and all parts of that whole entire, and even parts of Africa, had a chance to be able to be governed and ruled in the same way that the indigenous beings of North America were ruled for hundreds of thousands of years. Not as being ruled by gods or kings, but them being the rulers over themselves, and then rulers over others that are under their care. That's who we are. And right now we need to understand that this Sherman Order Field Order number 15 was an executive order which can be put back into place in any specific time by a sitting president. And we're demanding that to be done. We're demanding that to be done, and we're demanding it to be done also through UN proclamations as well. In other words, we're noticing the world that we as the black people, African American people, the so-called Negroes of North America, the actual original indigenous beings, want to be governed, want our communities to rise up, and we want to have full control over ourselves as autonomy of people. Because this is what it's supposed to be. And as you can see, we had the leadership of old, a little more than 100 years ago, who had an opportunity to actually do what they thought would never have to be done, without bullets, without war, without senseless death, further death. Because in our war, over 100 million people were slaughtered, killed, raped, and brutalized off of this land. 100 million killed. And it wasn't from disease. It was from war. We as a people today must understand what we have to be able to do. The American people must understand that we as the so-called black people of the United States, we the so-called African American people in the United States, we the so-called Negroes of the United States are not as such as what you have the ideas and the perception that you put on us, the names that you put on us, the associations that you put on us, that we are the actual original indigenous beings of North America. And I stick with North America, even though it is of the Americas, but I stick with North America because over a 500-year period, less than 300,000 people actually entered into the United States from Africa. And those 300 people that actually entered in, some of those were retreads from the United States. Some of those were people that were coming out of Europe as they were ethnically cleansing the European population. And a lot of those Africans that actually came over here, what you would call Africans, I don't even like the word African, but a lot of those, what you call from that continent that came over here, were so sick that they didn't last 60 to 90 days, no less a year, or have the abilities of procreation. And most of those people were males. So when you come down to it, you have way less than 300,000 people coming in to North America, actually reaching the shores of North America. I want to close with a speech from Patrick Henry. A speech that we need to actually understand that we have to have in our own Congress today and in many of our nation Congresses, for them to be able to come and be a part of a collective so that we can all speak with one voice. Because we have everything to lose and nothing to gain staying in a system that is geared to genocide us off the face of this earth and never give back anything that we, as beings of people, as a right, a universal right to be able to have. Now, these people can make a speech like this because they don't want to be under the authoritative capacity of a king. And they were committing everything that they had to it. Why should we, as the original indigenous being, turn our backs on our forefathers that gave us our land and the right to have our land back long before the Civil Rights Movement? This 40 acres, Field Order number 15 by Sherman, approved through the executive order by the president, supported by the Congress of the Republicans, is the only righteous act the United States government, the corporate government of the United States, has ever done for our people in trying to rectify what has actually gone on. The civil rights and all these other type of things were based in keeping you with inside of the system. Any treaty that was given out to any of these Indians were all of them, over 400 treaties, all of them, were never kept. Were never kept. And the reason why they weren't kept for the American Indians, because they were turncoats anyway. They turned their backs on the people that were protecting them for over 10,000 years. They made themselves, we made them a part of our society, our empires. We gave them the ability to be able to survive, as we gave the ability for the new Europeans that came over to our land to be able to survive on our land. And they turned their back against us. This is the reason why they have absolutely no respect for the United States government or any other government really on the face of the earth now. And any of their religious prospects can only be entitled through the animal spirit and not the universal spirit, because the karma of what they have done, of killing, of being a part of destroying a civilization, empire states of over 100 million people, are resting on their souls and their spirits and littered in the ground, the sacred ground of North America. So as you listen to this, I want you to understand that this is where we need to be. This is where your head needs to be. Our own politics. This is what needs to happen for us. The truth of the 40 acres and a mule is based in the reality of the original indigenous beings reestablishing themselves on their own land and going forth in freedom and governing themselves and raising up their own communities and community nations, so that we will have a direct responsibility of not only governing, of not only having our own land back, but also securing our own economics. And this is why, when I learned this in school, Malcolm X talked about Patrick Henry. A lot of our leaders talk about the veracity on how these supposed founding fathers got together to rid themselves of a situation that wasn't even half as worse of what we're in right now.
opposition comports with the warlike preparations which cover our waters and darken our land. Are fleets and armies necessary to a work of love and reconciliation? Have we shown ourselves so unwilling to be reconciled that force must be called in to win back love? Let us not deceive ourselves, sir. These are the implements of war and subjection, the last arguments to which kings resort. I ask the gentlemen, sir, what means this martial array if its purpose be not to force us into subjection? Can gentlemen assign any other possible motive for it? Has Great Britain any enemy in this quarter of the world to call for all this accumulation of navies and armies? No, sir, she has not. They are meant for us, and they can be meant for no other. They were sent over to bind and rivet upon us those chains which the British ministry has been so long forging. And what have we to oppose them? Shall we try argument? Sir, we have been trying that for the last 10 years. Have we anything new to offer upon the subject? Nothing. We have held the subject up to every light of which it is capable, but it has been all in vain. Shall we resort to entreaty and humble supplication? And what terms shall we find which have not already been exhausted? Let us not, I beseech you, sir, deceive ourselves longer. We have done everything that could be done to avert the storm that is now coming on. We have petitioned, we have remonstrated, we have supplicated, and we have prostrated ourselves before the throne and implored its interposition to arrest the tyrannical hands of the ministry and parliament. Our petitions have been slighted. Our remonstrances have produced additional violence and insult. Our supplications have been disregarded, and we have been spurned with contempt from the foot of the court. In vain after these things may we indulge the vain hope of peace and reconciliation. There is no longer any room for hope. If we wish to be free, if we mean to preserve inviolate those inestimable privileges for which we have so long been contending, if we mean not to vaguely abandon that noble struggle in which we have been so long engaged and which we have pledged ourselves never to abandon until the glorious object of our contest has been obtained, we must fight. I repeat it, sir, we must fight. An appeal to arms and the God of hosts is all that is left to us. They tell us, sir, that we are weak, unable to cope with so formidable an adversary. But when will we be strong? Will it be the next week or the next year? Will it be when we are totally disarmed and when a British guard is stationed in every house? Shall we gather strength by irresolution and inaction? Shall we learn the means of effectual resistance by lying supinely on our backs and hugging the delusive phantom of hope? Sir, we are not weak if we make use of those means which the God of nature hath placed in our power. 3 millions of people armed in the holy cause of liberty, and in such a country as that which we possess is invincible to any force our army can send against us. There is a just God who presides over the destinies of nations, who will raise up our friends to fight our battles for us. The battle, sir, is not to the brave alone, it is to the vigilant, the active, the brave. Besides, sir, we have no election. If we were base enough to desire it, it is now too late to retire from the contest. There is no retreat, but in submission and slavery our chains are forged. Their clanking may be heard on the plains of Boston. The war is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat, sir, let it come. It is in vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it the gentlemen wish? What would they have?
Give me liberty or give me death. If that's what they wanted for themselves, and they weren't even in any kind of position that the original indigenous being was in, how can you stand there and say, I want to be a part of a system that they themselves didn't even want to be a part of? We must find the strength to rise and to reclaim what is ours. We must be Spartan within inside of ourselves. We must redevelop our war councils. We must reestablish our chieftain councils. We must raise up in our Congress and reestablish our indigenous nations of North America. Not by ourselves, but standing together as one. Give up your fears. Protect our families, our land. And there you have it. This is Ronnie McLean for Dark Matter Radio. The truth about 40 Acres and a Mule is the reestablishment of the indigenous nations of North America and the land that was promised to end the war in order from Sherman Field Order Number 15, given by President Lincoln and crushed by Andrew Jackson and the people that killed our future, ourselves. Let's stand up and reestablish ourselves once again. And for all you people that are out there, I know, whether you're white, black, whatever you call yourselves, come together and support the reestablishment of Sherman Order Field Order Number 15, and the reestablishment of the indigenous nations of North America. Have a great day, everyone. May love and great grand rising be with you all. We are the original indigenous beings of North America, and I am proud to be indigenous. This is Dark Matter Radio. Have a great night.
Spartans never retreat. Spartans never surrender.
Tommy Lee Sparta. Thank you for this song. Give all the credit to him. Thank you for listening to Dark Matter Radio.